Hello and good morning. My name is Jennifer Jihye Chun, and on behalf of the International Institute and the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The Ungrateful Refugee, Dina Nayeri in conversation with Evyn Espiritu Gandhi. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, UCLA pays our respects to the Hanukvitam ancestors, Ahihirom elders, and Iyuhinkem, our relatives' relations, past, present, and emerging. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers, let me take a couple minutes to share a bit about our series. Global Racial Justice and the Everyday Politics of Crisis and Hope is a year-long webinar series sponsored by the International Institute. It builds on conversations that began in the summer of 2020 amidst the groundbreaking Black Lives Matter movement and the urgent political questions it raised and continues to raise about police brutality and racial injustice. At that time, tens of millions of people took to the streets during a deadly pandemic to demand justice and dignity for Black communities, both in the US and around the world. More than a year later, we are still battling the deadly coronavirus while contending with the toxic, entrenched, and wide-reaching connections between systemic racism and white supremacy that diminish too many communities of color and oppressed peoples. Certainly, there has been significant change in government and policy and public awareness. Yet there's also been backlash and disheartening and frustrating setbacks, including last Friday's outrageous acquittal. These conditions can stoke feelings of hopelessness and despair about the slow pace of change and the sheer vastness of inequality that engulfs the ever-increasing divide between the haves and have-nots. During these moments, it is more important than ever to direct our attention to the creative, risk-taking, resourceful, and bold imaginations of people who have long fought oppression and continue to put their bodies and lives on the line for a more just world that is abolitionist at heart. This series aspires to do just that. Today, we are thrilled to have celebrated author Dina Nayeri with us to share her insights and experiences as a child refugee from Iran and her work as an advocate for contemporary refugees. She will be joined by Professor Evyn Espiritu Gandhi, my wonderful colleague in Asian American Studies, who envisioned and co-organized today's event and will moderate the conversation. Professor Gandhi, an assistant professor in the UCLA Asian American Studies Department, is an expert in critical refugee studies, settler colonial studies, and trans-Pacific studies. Her forthcoming book, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese refugee settlers and decolonization across Guam and Israel-Palestine, will be out this spring with UC Press. Congratulations, Evans. I encourage all of you to snap it up. As many of you know, we rescheduled the event date from last Friday to today to stand in solidarity with our fellow faculty represented by the UC AFT. We are happy to report that the union and the university averted a two-day strike by reaching a tentative agreement last Friday that provides much greater job protection for the 6,500 lecturers who work across the University of California system. Their fight to democratize an academic labor market plagued by precarity and inequality is central to the core values that anchor our series. Many thanks to our co-presenter, the Asian American Studies Department, and our many generous co-sponsors. In light of time constraints, you can find the names of individual centers and departments in the chat. I am particularly thankful to the leadership and my fellow colleagues at the International Institute for their ongoing support and commitment to the series. Today's conversation will be organized in two parts, beginning with a dialogue between Dina and Evyn, and then an open Q&A. During their conversation, we encourage audience members to post their questions in the Q&A box and to upvote questions you are particularly keen to hear. There are many of us here today, almost 150 of us. The chat function is enabled, and we encourage you to respectfully share your comments and reflections. So without further ado, I turn things over to Professor Gandhi.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and I'll invite Dina to join me as well. So I just want to echo my gratitude to all of our co-sponsors and give a special shout out to the students in my critical refugee studies class. We read Dina's book together and we're so excited to engage in conversation with you. So it's my absolute honor to introduce our esteemed guest speaker for today, Dina Nayeri. So Dina is the author of 2 novels, as well as a book of creative nonfiction, The Ungrateful Refugee, which first came out in 2019, and which is also the title of our event for today. The Ungrateful Refugee is winner of the Geschwister-Schultz Prize and finalist of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Kirkus Prize, the El Grand Prix de Lettres, and called by The Guardian a work of astonishing and insistent importance. Dina is currently a fellow at the American Library in Paris and is joining us today from the south of France. So welcome so much, Dina. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Evyn. Thank you for the wonderful invitation and to all of you for being here. It's a real honor.
So feel free, folks in the audience, to give us a warm welcome. I know you can't clap, but you can show your welcome and your thanks in the chat as well. So I definitely encourage you to engage as we engage in this conversation, and definitely post your comments and questions in the chat, as well as use the Q&A function if you'd like to post your Q&A. We'll definitely have time at the end for your questions as well. So we'll go ahead and start our conversation. Wonderful. So I'm really, so honored to be in conversation with you. This book is so amazing. It's such an incisive and geographically expansive book, right? It spans Iran, Italy, Oklahoma, Amsterdam, and Greece, to name just a few. And I really appreciate how it interweaves your own family's refugee flight from Iran in the 1980s with the narratives of more contemporary refugee migration from Iran, Afghanistan, as well as Syria. So just to start us off, why don't you share a little bit more about your family's refugee story and how it informed the writing of this book?
Sure. I feel like our story of our displacement and migration, and that entire resetting that happened to me between the ages of 8 and 10 has informed almost everything I've written indirectly until the moment where I decided to just look at it face on. When I decided to change careers, I was in the business world, decided to become a writer in my 20s, and I went right to fiction. And I think because fiction felt so comfortable and so it felt so right, a way to be, creative and artistic and imagine all of these worlds at the same time using my own. But, it was a little bit of a veil to hide behind. And I think part of it was because of the fact that there was so much on process for me. There was so much that I didn't, yet want to talk about until 2015, when the world just suddenly felt different. I had spent so much time becoming American and assimilating to the West, and I felt comfortable. And suddenly, I moved to the UK, I had a baby, there was the Brexit vote, there was the Trump election, all of that just happened at once. There was the refugee crisis, the images, they just took me right back to my childhood. And to tell you a little bit about that, because that's what you asked for. I was born in 1979, right when the Iranian Revolution happened. So Iran went from kind of a westernizing secular country to an Islamic republic. And then there were 8 years of war. So I grew up in the first few years of my life under war, in a really precarious political situation. And then my mother decided to convert to Christianity and to become, so not only to become an apostate, but to become a proselytizing apostate, which I can't tell you how completely dangerous that is in not just the Islamic Republic, but in a newly formed Islamic Republic. So very quickly, she was thrown into prison and her life was threatened, and we escaped. So I was in Iran until I was 8. We escaped the country when I was 8, and we were refugees until I was 10. And well, at first we were just undocumented, or as they called us back then, illegal. And then we were granted refugee status by UNHCR, and we were put in a refugee camp. And then we were granted asylum when I was 10 years old to America, and we were sent to Oklahoma. So from then on, I kind of started the journey of becoming American, which the book also partly explores.
Yeah, thank you. I want to pick up on this point that you started with in the beginning of your answer, right? How you turned to fiction first, and it wasn't until later in your career that you started with the nonfiction. So I just want to give a shout out to your previous two novels, A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, as well as Refuge, which both also feature Iranian subjects, right? So I actually read Refuge prior to The Ungrateful Refugee, and that was sort of my introduction to your work. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what is the process like of writing fiction versus nonfiction. And you talked about this a little bit more, but maybe to elaborate on what inspired you, to change genres in this way.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that part first because I kind of started talking about it a little bit. But I think, when that moment happened in 2015, where it was this confluence of so many different things, the world felt like it was changing, not so, welcoming to as I thought maybe that it had been. Maybe there was all of the not welcome was bubbling under the surface, and all the hostility and all of that was kind of incubating there. It came out and it hit the political stage, and I suddenly felt like very much an outsider, and then at the same time became a mother. And I started to feel a little bit afraid for, when you become a mother, one thing that happens is that you feel this kind of visceral stake, I guess, when you become a parent, I should say, or when you have a vested interest in any child's life, really, you start to feel this visceral stake in the future. It becomes a little bit different than the abstract way that you viewed the future before. You start to kind of feel it on behalf of this child. And I felt really afraid about the way the world was turning, the way the world was, characterizing displacement, the way, just people were vilifying refugees and making them the root of problems that were actually systematic and started much long before. And I decided that I wanted to address it, in as myself, in a more rhetorical way, not so much just kind of bury it under 5 layers of subtext in fiction, but to come out there and just say something about the way that I think that the world is, and what it's doing wrong. And so, and another thing that happened is that my attention turned from my own story to other people's stories. I suddenly, wanted to go out there and explore what's happening now, what's happening to other children, what can be learned from my story that applies to people now. And so both of those things kind of pushed me a little bit more toward nonfiction, and a kind of nonfiction that weaves not just my own story, but with others, but also with kind of this essayistic reflection on, what is the ideal way for us to be? How should we be thinking about this? So kind of all of that kind of came together at once. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge space in my process and in my kind of creative workflow, I guess, for fiction, because that is, for me, a different kind of artistic output, and I need it as part of my work. With fiction, I feel that I guess my imagination is ignited in a different way. I'm able to kind of create in a different way, and I'm able to kind of slowly work my way toward the truth, using sensory detail, using the kind of truth of what's around me, created characters that take a lot of work. It's like carving a little bird out of a stone. You really make them slowly over time, and it's a different practice, and it nourishes me in a different way versus, say, setting out to write a book about something that needs addressing. Do you know what I mean? I think if you set out to write fiction about something that needs addressing, you're bound to write bad fiction, aren't you? So I guess that's kind of a little bit of the difference for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I love how in your answer, you're also sort of breaking down the barriers or the artificial divisions, right, between fiction and nonfiction, which I think is something that shows up, in this book, The Ungrateful Refugee, as well. You're really questioning this division between what's fact, what's fiction, what's truth, and what's a good story, right? And not just a story in terms of the novel or the narrative, but also a good story in terms of what is a sort of story that you're going to get asylum with, right?
Yeah. Well, exactly. But I think, but before we get to that, I just want to say the whole thing about creative writing, creative writing versus, say, journalism. I mean, creative writing, whether it's fiction, whether it's poetry, or whether it's creative nonfiction, it's all about kind of questing and looking for these answers in a way that's different from, say, well, here are the facts. Do you know what I mean? In the way that, but you were going to ask about asylum stories. Yeah.
So I mean, I'm just going to sort of build off of this question, in our conversation. I'm going to share a couple quotes from the book. Some of us have read it, some of them are still being introduced to your work. But I just want to pick up on this question of storytelling, right? And storytelling in the asylum process. So for example, in the book, you quote Ahmed Pori, who says, the asylum process is about crafting a story that is believed so that you can stop waiting and make a life, right? Yeah. And this question regarding, what kind of story is believable and to whom, right, really troubles this distinction between fact and fiction and truth and stories that you're talking about. So just share one more quote from the book that I find really inspiring. So you say, often the facts are the least believable, and it's fiction's job to fix them in the service of truth. A fact, given disproportionate context and attention, can lie about a life, a day or a marriage, a war, a childhood. A fiction can be true when it throws a light on the unseen, those unclaimed spectacles that occur again and again, but that shame and trauma keep hidden from view. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit more about the dynamic between fact and fiction.
Sure. I think in that section of the book, one thing I was talking about is this paradox about how some people conflate the idea of facts with truth. And I think most fundamentally bureaucrats do that, like asylum officers, for example, they have this checklist of facts and they decide your whole story is a lie if some of them there's inconsistency. But of course, there's many inconsistencies in true stories all the time. That's the world, life is messy, and there's different points of view, etc. So in this section, what I was talking about is how, one thing I've realized just in my writing education and in learning how to write is that you can absolutely lie with facts. There's a lot of very disingenuous news organizations who do that all the time. They say facts that are kind of true, but then they leave out others. Or, they throw a spotlight on one fact that's actually quite incidental compared to some other more important ones that are buried. So I think that the way you choose to craft the facts is really the thing that shows your allegiance to the truth, right? And then you have to actually acknowledge that every single truth must have a point of view because people's truths are very different, aren't they? Even when nobody actually lies, you know what I mean? So there's that, but then at the same time, I feel like with fiction, with the best literary fiction, while the whole thing is invented, there is this constant questing for some kind of truth, for the truth of not that character, but kind of a particular kind of moment between a particular kinds of people in a particular kind of situation. When all those things have come together, can you imagine your way to the truth of what might happen, what that might mean in a way that is true to how the world works for those kinds of people? Do you know what I mean? So I think you can absolutely lie with fiction too, but it has nothing to do with the inventedness of it, you see? And I think that's the thing that was fascinating for me, because one of my earliest experiences with truth telling or lies, with whether or not I was considered truthful, was in asylum interviews where everything is indeed this horrible checklist. I mean, today in my book, you've seen that, I've talked to asylum lawyers and former refugees who talk about how, if there was the slightest little inconsistency in something, like, for example, if they said they left their passport in one place at the beginning of the interview and 3 hours later they said they left their passport in another place, some trivial detail, they would say, well, you didn't say that before, so you're a liar. The whole thing is considered a lie. It's an absurd, not just a box ticking exercise, but just kind of rooting out the tiniest reason to say no. Well, because the asylum officers are no longer honest listeners, because what they're doing is essentially just looking to fill quotas of rejections, right? So I think part of telling a truthful story, part of the process of it is telling and receiving a truthful story is the person on the other end. That person has to be open to a truth. Otherwise, the story goes nowhere, I suppose. It doesn't serve its purpose.
Yeah, definitely. And I like how you are drawing our attention to the honest listener as well, right? But also what truth is depends on the listener and the audience, right? So one of the things that I also appreciate is you tell us and really draw our attention to the different narrative dynamics and the narrative tropes, I guess, or traditions of different asylum countries, right? They're all different. So you say, because to pass an asylum interview, you don't just need a true story. You need to tell the story the English way or the Dutch way or the American way. Americans enjoy drama. They want to be moved. The Dutch want facts. The English have precedents, story from each country deemed true that year or that month. So that's from your book. So can you elaborate on this dynamic and maybe how you see it playing out in the contemporary moment?
Sure. Well, I mean, you know that storytelling is cultural. All storytelling is cultural. We learn it from childhood. We learn it from our parents and grandparents in the most intimate of settings. Oral storytelling, oral tradition, from people who aren't necessarily like storytelling, craftsmen. What they are is they're receiving something. They're receiving the craft from others, and they're passing it on. So and then outside or within that, you've got your culture, your country's culture of storytelling, and then you've got cultures created in various systems. So, for example, the asylum system has a culture in each country, right? Which is where like things like the precedents come in. In the UK, for example, as soon as someone from Sri Lanka comes through, they check the precedents for that country. What's going on there? Is this a believable reason for this person to be coming here? So all of those cultures overlap, and they determine whether or not the person receiving the story will believe it, right? One of the asylum officers that I talked to in the Netherlands said that, he has the hardest time with Iranians, because Iranians have been taught to tell stories in a very specific way. And that is that we don't start stories at the beginning of our lives or at the beginning of the story, or we don't cut to the chase. We start the story at the beginning of the universe. I swear, every Iranian story starts at the beginning of the universe. And the way we've received that instruction is that there's a particular rhyme that all children say at the beginning of their stories, which is the beginning of the universe rhyme. And literally every single story that you hear when you're a kid starts with that rhyme. So naturally, when you're an adult and you sit down and somebody says, okay, tell me your story, you're not like trained like, Spielberg to cut to the chase and be like,
Sure,
so we're sitting in a torture room. No, you say, well, the world is a place like this. And then as soon as you start to pontificate about the world, and then, you slowly move on to the 1979 revolution, by that point, the asylum officers completely decided that you're a liar, because why do you keep hedging, they believe? What you're doing, though, is you're putting your entire story in a perspective, because, Iranian storytelling is about the perspective of you as an individual in the wider world, or in the grander world. And that's just not the same in the West. So this asylum officer also told me that the people who have the easiest time convincing asylum officers of all of the things that they've survived are the ones who have closest access to Western culture, either Western education, or they're wealthier, or they come from countries that are more Westernized, which is a real shame.
Definitely. So I want to ask you a little bit about storytelling in relation to secrets. So you share at the beginning of your book, you say, quote, "There are secrets that I can show the native born, the new arrivals don't dare reveal, but have, quote, wished to say for 30 years and found it terrifying until now." So talk a little bit about your process, right? So then you came across dozens of stories after, quote, traveling to refugee camps in Greece and visiting immigration lawyers, as you've talked about, drinking tea with refugees and asylum seekers, among many different encounters. So how and why did these experiences lead you to share what you describe as such terrifying secrets?
Yeah, well, I think I noticed, and I actually kind of knew in a subconscious place all of my life, that one of the biggest, I guess, psychological side effects of all of what's happened is just this shame, this like pervasive shame over the course of your entire life. And this kind of grappling with the question of dignity, like, what do I need to feel like, my most dignified self, or the person that I was before? And why is there this continuing like feeling of shame that's following me around now that I've left my home country? And these were not explicit questions I asked myself, but they were questions that were definitely following me around. And they became much more explicit when I went back to the refugee camps and saw, like, oh my gosh, this is so familiar. There's such an overwhelming feeling of just shame for everything that's happened, for every single one of our own cultural, traditions and mores, for the poverty, for the loss of identity, for the fact that we no longer have our professions and can't be useful right away. I mean, all of these things add up to make you just apologize for your very existence from the moment you step into the new land. And that's just really hard on the psyche. It's really hard on your sense of self. It makes you, feel like you've lost all dignity. And and for me, that is the thing that makes you keep secrets, you know, and some of the secrets aren't even worthy of secrets. I mean, the things I have seen people hide. I was talking to someone earlier we were talking about writing believable poverty, you know, and one of the things we discussed is that when people are truly poor, systematically poor over the and especially displaced people, they do so much that they don't need to hide it from people who might be helpful, you know. They spend money in ways they shouldn't because they want to hide the poverty. And there were so many moments like that in my own childhood, you know, not saying to parents of my friends, no, we can't go to this restaurant because I can't pay my share, or like, I can't go to this. And instead trying to find a way out of it in these like crazy ways. I mean, that kind of like just diligent secret keeping about nonsense. This isn't even like the real things. Like, here's the things that I did in Iran that got me into trouble. I mean, I've talked to refugees who are like, say 20 years later, who are just starting to admit, okay, well, you know, I became a refugee because I did this, this, and this, you know, and I got in trouble with the government. They didn't, I mean, even though you have to admit those things in order to gain asylum, you know, once you arrive in the West, you kind of want to bury those stories, and you think, okay, well, if I admit, you know, my own role in my own displacement, then I'm at fault, and I have to, you know, kind of confess to the native born that I brought this on myself. And even though obviously there's systematic, you know, corruptions at play here that may put you in an impossible situation, you still take that guilt and shame upon yourself. And so 20 years later, they're only then able to admit that, you know what, yeah, I had to do that stuff, you know. It's I think, you know, the answer to your question, like you said, talk about, well, I guess what drives secret keeping in this context. And I think the main thing is the constant search to regain your dignity and the constant shame.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good place to talk about the title of the book, right? Because I think these feelings of shame that you're talking about are related to this imperative to also express gratitude, right, to the native born or to the host country. But you call your book The Ungrateful Refugee. So tell us a little bit more about this title, and how does, you know, the politics of ingratitude play out for you?
Well, I wouldn't call it ingratitude, because remember, but for me, I call it the ungrateful refugee because it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of reappropriating that horrible phrase, which it contains so much assumption. I mean, when and of course it was coined by, you know, unwelcoming native-born people in the West who say, oh, well, what an ungrateful refugee or whatever. And the reason that I thought, you know, I think it contains so much is because, I mean, you never hear, oh, you know, you never hear the ungrateful doctor, you never hear the ungrateful, you know, like expat, you never hear, you know, about ungrateful anything, but we've all heard the term ungrateful refugee. So what that implies is that refugees should be grateful, not, you know, so somehow they should be more grateful than the native born. And I want to like question that. First of all, why should they be more grateful than the native born who've won the lottery of birth, right? Who should be, you know, counting their blessings for this thing they didn't earn, which is that they were born in the West and free, right? The refugees have less to be grateful for because they had to struggle for that same freedom to get to that same place, right? And then after they got there, let's say then they have the same level of gratitude, which I think is fair. They shouldn't have more. Why should they have to posture it? You know, I think the point here is that I think gratitude is a private sentiment, and it's one that's shared by every single refugee I know. I am incredibly grateful. I'm grateful every day. Every refugee that I've ever met is grateful every day. And so it's not ingratitude, it's the refusal to make theater of it for the benefit of the native born. It's the refusal to posture and perform it for the comfort of the native born. It's a refusal to, you know, have like someone's foot shoved under your nose as you're bowing down to your own God, right? Like, no, you can't channel some things like respect and love and gratitude. And I refuse to have people try to channel that using these indirect ways by creating these phrases like the ungrateful refugee. Well, you know what? You're ungrateful, a native born person who doesn't see how incredibly lucky you've been in this extremely unearned way, right? So, I mean, I guess the phrase for me is much, much more about performance than it is about actual gratitude. Because I actually think if somebody wanted to talk to me privately, if a displaced person or anybody, about the role of gratitude in my life and in my healing and their life and their healing, I would say that it's absolutely essential, of course, right? But it's a private thing between you and whoever you choose to direct that gratitude toward. Do you choose to direct it toward a God, toward a community, toward a small group of people, one person? It's yours to do with what you will.
Yeah, I appreciate, you drawing that distinction and thinking about this imperative to perform gratitude, right, to the government, to sort of, outside news media, and really attending to the privacy, which is also, I think, relates to your idea of dignity and refugee dignity that you've been talking about.
Because, I think the thing I was saying before about how, for kind of how long and how kind of persistently refugees wear this shame, and carry it around with them, even if they don't realize it. I think it's most obvious in the performance of the gratitude theater, right? Because they are constantly trying to please the native born. They're constantly seeing themselves through the gaze of the native born, constantly remaking themselves and trying to fit themselves into these kind of like the cultural requirements of the native born. All of that comes with the assumption that they don't belong there. They're making life uncomfortable for them, and therefore they should make it as obvious as they can that they're going to be, appreciative and servile and a help to them and not get in the way of anything, right? And just they do that by showing that theater. Well, that's not real gratitude. That's actually shame, right? That's causing you to do that, I actually think my own gratitude to America is displaced most obviously by the fact that I criticize America, right? I mean, like, I want America to be better because it's my home, because I love it,
Definitely. So we've been talking a lot about people who pass the asylum test, right? And who do get, refugee status, to get asylum and eventual citizenship, perhaps in a host nation. So I want to talk a little bit more about people who don't get that luxury, right? And part of, one of the things I appreciate in this book, but also in your other work, you're trying to break down this distinction between who's a refugee, who's considered an economic migrant, who's considered illegal, and that's terrible term. So can you talk a little bit about that distinction and how you're trying to break it down?
Yeah, I think that distinction, it's a little bit outdated for one thing. I mean, first of all, let's just kind of clarify for everyone what a refugee is, right? A refugee, according to the Geneva Convention, which, or the Refugee Convention, I guess, in 1951, is defined as someone who can't return safely to their home country for, kind of a credible fear of persecution or harm or death, any kind of injury based on one of 5 criteria, which is their race, religion, national identity, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group, right? So those are the kind of the 5 ways that you can be a refugee. Now, as you can imagine, that leaves out a ton of people. Like, so what if there's war in your country and you're in danger? Well, you don't meet one of those criteria. If like, say, there's so much chaos as a result of, say, gangs or as a result of corruption, and that chaos isn't directed at you, it can still kill you, but it's not directed at you, then you're not a refugee. I mean, you can gain entry into other countries through other means if there's such chaos that, for example, countries decide to systematically take in people from your country. But you wouldn't be specifically a refugee. So you have to prove that you were individually targeted for one of these 5 reasons. Now, the fifth reason, membership in a social group, that was created by the Refugee Convention framers to be a kind of a catch-all. They didn't know what the next Holocaust would be. This was 1951, right? They didn't know based on what the next genocide would happen. So they kind of did a "and other reasons" category, right? But the definition of that has been kind of narrowed more and more and more by judges in these countries that want to shut their doors. So like in the US, they were saying, for example, okay, well, women are not a social group. Battered women are not a social group. Like so if you're a battered woman, you can't, apply for asylum based on that, because that doesn't count, right? Well, I think that the framers of the Geneva Convention or the Refugee Convention would have said that it counts, right? So the whole thing, it feels a little bit outdated. And then you have the spectrum of people and the reasons that they travel, and it's incredibly complex. You've got the people who are persecuted, right? And it's very obvious why they're persecuted. Let's say they're a journalist, anti-regime journalist in Iran, and they have lots of proof and articles they've written. Fine, that person is gotten in trouble with the government, maybe they can prove they're a real refugee. But then you've got people who aren't willing to admit the reason. So for example, let's say you run away from Iran because you're gay and you've seen 5 of your friends be hanged for homosexual activity, right? You weren't targeted yet, but you know what? You're going to be. You have a reasonable fear. And let's say you get into another country and you have, thousands of years of cultural homophobia that have just been fed to you over your 18 years of life, and you are not willing to admit to yourself that you are gay, right? Then what? Then there's that kind of problem. The asylum officers don't have the nuance to deal with that, I can promise you. What if you're a rape victim? What if you're a torture victim? What if you're so full of shame and trauma that you can't actually say what happened to you, right? That's another problem. And then, okay, so let's come a little bit more along the spectrum. What about people who are, again, victims of war, victims of gangs, victim of any kind of situation that isn't targeting them specifically? They don't qualify. Pretty soon we're going to have like huge waves of climate refugees. They're not going to qualify. So I think we need to rethink displacement, what causes it and how we can address it, and how we can address it in a way that's humane and doesn't put people in the spot of like proving horrible things. You should read some of the transcripts of these asylum interviews and the things that they ask people. Like how many people were in the room when you were raped? How many of them raped you? And do you think they were raping you because you happened to be there, or did they come looking for you? I mean, if your system is such that you have to ask those questions because the motivation of the perpetrator matters so much, then you need to rethink the entire system. And then, of course, I think the question you were getting at the beginning is this other question that I ask is, when you come further along the spectrum of reasons for leaving, let's say past climate refugees, then you get to the portion that's about economic refugees. What about the people who just can't survive or have any kind of a decent life for themselves and their family after they in their own country? We call them economic migrants and we look down on them. Why? Wouldn't you do the same thing? Wouldn't you also try to leave and find some opportunity and a decent life for your family? Isn't that also a way that your life can be ruined? So, I feel that like all of this kind of needs to be remade in a more modern way, in a way that acknowledges all the wrongs that we as Western countries have committed against these other countries, and acknowledges also that everyone was born with the same rights to opportunity, regardless of what country they were born into, and that our children of the Western born don't deserve more. They just don't.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate how you sort of pointing us to these different gradations and also stories of displacement, right? And I think it's a lot of what we try to do in my class. This class I'm teaching on critical refugee studies is to move beyond this very narrow UN definition, right, of the refugee and what the UN considers, credible fear based on these 5 categories that you mentioned, and really think about these other forms of displacement and how can we put them in conversation with one another. So I just want to sort of give it a shout out to the audience. Please post your questions in the Q&A. We will move to the Q&A, audience Q&A portion very soon. So I know that we have a couple questions already in the Q&A, but I just want to flag that for people. So I want to talk a little bit maybe about feminist politics and how it informs this book, right? So you write that, feminist politics is something that was very strongly instilled in you by your Baba, and that directly defines your identity. So how do you make sense of maybe the complex ways that gender and women's rights are always sort of appealed to, right, by the US government as like reasons for intervention, right, in the Middle East and the Swana region? So can you sort of talk us through, these complex dynamics of how gender and sort of saving brown women, this rhetoric gets deployed?
Well, I think this is a really complicated one because I've seen some terrible arguments on every side of this. And I think the problem is, the issue is that, like, when you go to a country like Iran, right, it's there's not one overarching problem. You've got minority groups within minority groups, each with their own needs and each with like their own ways of being suppressed, right? So within particular like smaller groups of people, there's a whole complex range of kind of forces that are applied to their lives, and we can't judge them according to our values in the West. I mean, one of the things that you were referring to is the fact that when we came to the US, there was a lot of, oh, are the men horrible in Iran? And, oh, you got saved by America from, this horrible sexist place. And the thing is, I feel like on a day-to-day basis, I experience as much sexism in Oklahoma and in a Christian setting than I did in Iran. I mean, in Iran, my father told me, you have to study, you have to get a PhD, there's no excuse otherwise, you don't want to marry somebody who's going to rule your life, you have to make these choices for yourself. And in the church in Oklahoma, it was all very much about wives submit to your husbands, and the husband is the head of the household and all of that. So, it felt really much more progressive to be in my father's house, let's just say. And then my mother too, although she's Christian and she kind of buys into a lot of these Christian things, but she also was this kind of strong-minded, she's a medical doctor, and she was all about her own, career and progress in education and about making her own decisions. And I think in many ways, she was a closet feminist. And she would be enraged every time she ran into one of these like Islamic Republic laws that made her rights less than a man's. But at the same time, right, I also kind of get upset where people make blanket statements like, well, let's leave the Iranian women alone because they're all happy with forced hijab because they're Muslims. No. There's plenty of Iranian women who are extremely unhappy with forced hijab, right? That's the nuance there. You have all of these different groups of people, right? And there is issues of religion, issues of class oppression, and economic oppression, issues of like, cultures of individual regions, etc. And you can't make a statement like, well, the Islamic Republic is sexist and let's go save the women. But you also can't make a statement like, well, let's not say anything about hijab because that's, us being Western people. You have to be specific. You have to make comments like, well, it's not like forced hijab does not mesh with, kind of a liberal way of life. It is not progressive. It's not fair, but then again, neither is like France's practice of not allowing burkinis on the beach, right? But I think all of these issues have to be addressed in a way that is kind of specific and local because there are so many overlaying identity issues at play.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate how you're drawing our attention to this nuance, which gets so lost, I think in a lot of these public debates that we have in these sort of government and global debates.
Yeah, well, I think the key answer to all this is be specific and be nuanced, right? Like make blanket statements at your own peril.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So now let's sort of transition. We have about 30 minutes left. So I'm happy to transition now to the Q&A portion. I know some folks have been responding a lot in the chat. I do ask that you post your questions in this specific Q&A box that just helps us as hosts to keep track of them. So I'll go ahead and start reading some of our questions in the Q&A. I also invite the audience, we want as much participation as possible. So you do have the option to upvote questions. So if there's a question that, resonates with you or that, you also want to ask, that would be a reason to upvote a question. We'll make sure to prioritize that. So the first question is from Suraj. So he says, thank you, Dina. I teach refugee law in India, and the course starts with your piece in The Guardian, which is much loved by students. So glad to have read your book through Professor Gandhi on my course. So my question is about your reflections on teaching. So you note that Middle Eastern students in your class are often the quietest, despite the materials you cover having themes which often resonate strongest with them. And this happens across other educational institutions. So in light of this advice, what advice would you have for educators and students who belong to immigrant or refugee backgrounds?
Well, thank you for that question. And thank you so much for teaching my work. I always appreciate it when people do that. And I'm so glad that, Evyn, you're amazing for doing that and for being this kind of conduit for the work to reach others.
I mean, thanks for writing.
I think, for I think it's kind of a fine balance here, because one thing I found is that the refugee and the displaced students have so much to say when they feel safe and comfortable saying it. And yet at the same time, I know that there have been times where I've wanted to, kind of like force the connection between a particular story and their experience. And I've made them uncomfortable, because that feeling of safety, that feeling that you're not going to feel ashamed is absolutely paramount, And so one thing that I often do is teach stories that are kind of circle a particular issue, right? And don't call them out to respond to it with their own experiences, but like we'll read a story about, we'll read a lot of stories about shame, humiliation, and dignity, right? The loss of shame in different situations. It doesn't necessarily have to do with a different culture. You see, like you read a story about a, mother and daughter profoundly disconnecting. You read a story about someone, I don't know, spending a day homeless. You read a story about, somebody fundamentally misunderstanding someone of the opposite sex. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to be humiliated. But once you've read 3 or 4 stories that circle your particular themes, then you start to understand the universality of it all, right? And how very kind of, I guess, strange and beautiful it all can be. And I think that might take a while and a little bit of trust, but I think like really thinking about the stories you're assigning and what they might trigger in displaced people is important, and then giving them the space to kind of come in with their own perspectives. I always found that in the second half of the semester, or in like the final weeks of the semester, I got so much more involvement, participation, and personal engagement, because I mean, in the first like class, when I assign a story, they don't know where I'm coming from. They don't know why that story is important. They don't know like what is it I'm trying to teach. By like the 20th shame story that they've read, they get it. Like they get that this is actually, we all share this kind of stuff. It's universal and interesting, and not at all something to hide away. And also then I give them lots of opportunity to write their own short pieces, their own little creative writing exercises, not necessarily to commit to an entire short story, but to write a scene, I found that a lot comes out when you ask people to write about subtext. So I do exercises in which I have people write a dialogue, like, I don't know, a 2-page dialogue between 2 people who hear some of the unspoken stuff between them, right? And what they choose to write, I think, reveals a lot about their own experiences of that particular thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those exercises. It's always great to sort of hear more about pedagogy. We have a question here about the writing of your book. So what is the reason behind the overall structure of your novel? So the 5 acts and then the stories interspersed. So can you talk a little bit about how you structured your book, I guess, The Ungrateful Refugee?
Sure. Oh, I'm trying to follow you on the questions, but anyway.
Oh, this is from Min E. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So talk about the structure of the book. Well, I mean, I think, let me see, I kind of started it, I started it kind of trying to understand the what had changed and what had stayed the same between my story and the stories of today's refugees, right? And I'm in a different moment in my refugee journey than most of the people that I met are, So very quickly, I realized, okay, there are some parallels here, but how's their experience going to be in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years? These are things I can't know. So I suddenly became aware that there's these kind of 5 stages. And I remember I sat down and I thought about it. I'm like, well, if we're in 2 different stages, like how many different like distinct stages are there? And this kind of very early on became the skeleton of the book for me, because I realized very quickly that each of these stages not only has secrets, as I was saying before, like things that the native born don't know, but also each one of them has a really clear parallel to a universal experience that the native born will understand. Like, for example, waiting in a camp is not that different than waiting for something like vital and life-changing for anyone, right? We know what waiting is like. We know what it's like to be forced to wait by someone who has more power than you. And so, framed that way, you can really understand that portion of the refugee's journey. And I think that understanding can bring empathy. Same with, storytelling, like the asylum portion, out of the 5 is all about storytelling. And we've all tried to convince someone who doesn't believe, right? That's universal, isn't it? And again, that can build build empathy, and same with trying to change ourselves to fit a particular mold. That's the assimilation portion, and so on and so forth. So all 5 of them had something that I think that really resonated with the native born's just normal human experience, right? So I thought that that was really important to make those connections, and then also just to reveal some of the secrets of each of those particular phases.
Yeah, thank you.
It felt like a natural skeleton.
Yeah. So we have a question here from Amelia, which has received a couple upvotes, which is really kind of a call to action question for you. So she says, I've talked to many Americans who, for one reason or another, become aware of the injustices of the immigration and refugee system, perhaps through powerful books, such as your own. But many become frustrated with a sense of futility. So what do we do with the knowledge we now have? So what do you suggest for ways ordinary people can engage in this issue? And how can everyday Americans be a part of the solution to this issue after they become aware of it?
Yeah. So I think it's really helpful to try to divide this into kind of 3 parts, into short-term things that can make life less hellish for refugees, for medium-term things, and then much longer-term things. And I think the thing that makes you perhaps feel like futile or like there's nothing you can do, that you are powerless in the system, is that you see the long-term things. Which is good to see, that, the system needs to change. We need to look at displacement differently. We need to look at borders differently. We need to look at our what we owe to our fellow man kind of in a different way, right? And all of that stuff is just not going to change overnight, right? But there are things we can do to start that change. So I'll get to that in a minute. But in the short term, refugees have a lot of immediate needs that you can help meet. About things like food, shelter, legal representation, all of that stuff. So, I mean, if there's anything that you can do to give money to the organizations that are helping, especially with the ones that are helping with legal issues, that is really helpful. One thing that every immigration lawyer told me is that the biggest determinant of whether or not a refugee gets accepted or asylum seeker gets accepted is whether or not they have representation before they first speak to someone, right? As soon as they speak to someone without representation, they might say things that will damn their case, and those things are on their record forever, right? So, there's a lot of wonderful charities like the Young Center, for example, who go to the border and who provide free legal representation to undocumented minors, to families, to all kinds of people, right? So to be a part of that help, you can give money. If you know immigration lawyers, you can, help bring them over. I know people who bring caravans of lawyers to, to camps in Europe. That kind of thing is really helpful. Get involved in a charity. Let's see, aside from legal representation, there's the fact that in the refugee camps around the world are horrible places where people have to wait too long, right? They don't have much of what they need. The things that people send are useless. People send teddy bears, they don't have schools for their children. And sometimes they stay there for 2 years. And for 2 years, their children's fire dies. They don't have any education. They don't have anyone coming to teach. So, if you have actual time that you can go and volunteer your time and teach children, you can do it in a grassroots way, go and do it. Or you could do it through organizations let's see, there's one called Second Tree in Katsikass that does education in the camps. There's one called Refugee Support that I've written about that does vocational training now for women. In the US, there's lots of them. You can look them up and be involved. Then you can also lobby for certain major rule changes. There's, I'd say, the biggest rule that harms asylum seekers that needs to be changed and changed quickly in Europe and America is that people are not allowed to work while they wait, right? Okay, so this whole illegal work thing, right? It doesn't protect any Americans. It just basically robs people of their identity because they're waiting for years and they're losing their skills. Why should they have to be working under the table? Work should have nothing to do with your immigration status, right? So lobby for them to be allowed to work. And you know what? If you have to, give them work off the books, if you can help people work for, their living instead of accepting the charity. But at the same time also, it's really important to give if you can, because people come to the US and they are mired in poverty and they don't have anything. They don't have cars when they need to go and which they need in order to go to work. They don't have money for transportation. They don't have money for new clothes. It makes it just all that much harder to really settle in. So if you can be part of a welcome organization that gives the items that refugees need. If you could be part of an organization that befriends migrants and refugees at the beginning when they first arrive, that can be really helpful. I mean, sometimes I think the hardest part of it all is just the fact that you don't have anyone. You don't have a sense of curiosity from people around and welcome about who you are and what you might contribute. All people care about is your like escape story, right? So if you can be someone who goes in and with a befriending organization and befriends someone, right, and gives them a community and invites them into your community, that can be incredible help. So all of those are short-term things, right? I'd say, I guess the lobbying falls more into medium-term things. But just to skip to the long-term things, I think like we can absolutely have a hand in changing these laws and changing these systems of thinking in the long term, not just by how we vote, but by how we educate our children. You know, I think it's really important, these like these debates currently about what's taught in schools, you know, to make sure that that we're teaching things like systematic racism in our schools, you know, and that we're teaching things like, you know, how our systems were created. What is the history of displacement? How has this country contributed to displacement around the world? You know, that kind of stuff really helps people understand at a young age that they are not entitled to everything that they're born. And then maybe the next generation will change it. I think it's important to teach philosophy. Like, for example, I always, you know, kind of do this exercise with young children, the Rawlsian original position exercise. You know this one, right? The idea that, you know, if you were behind a veil of ignorance in a kind of a position of not knowing what body you would be born into, what kind of a world would you create? Would you create a world in which some people are starving while some are billionaires? Probably not, because you might be one of those people who's starving. You don't know what body you're going to be born into. So do those kind of exercises so that people can think through, or children at a young age can think through, like, wow, I mean, what do I deserve? And what should I give to other people? And what kind of a world do I want to make, instead of just taking what's given to me as a finished product and, you know, as a given. So those are things we can do in the long term. That was kind of, sorry, long-winded. But
no, thank you. Yeah.
Volunteer, give money, help them get education, help them get legal help, and help them get work.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate how you sort of break down this short-term, medium-term, long-term projects, which gives us multiple points of intervention and ways to act.
Yeah.
So this next question is from Maria, and it'll give you a chance to talk about future work, but also talk a little bit more about what you're doing in France. So Maria says, I was wondering if you could share if you are currently working on a project in France. Also, do you have any insight on the differences or similarities between immigration policies in the US versus France? As a Mexican American who lived in France during my teenage years, I definitely felt that it was a bit difficult to assimilate to France. And feel a part of the country and the culture.
Yeah. Well, you know, unfortunately, I'm not like a huge France expert. I'm here because my partner, you know, is from here, and we escaped the pandemic, I guess. Yeah. And I was here for a fellowship. I was at the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris when the pandemic happened. So there's kind of that element of stuckness in my story here. But what am I working on? I am working on my next book, which is actually almost finished, called Who Gets Believed. And it takes this kind of you know, issue of believability codes and storytelling, you know, norms and all of that stuff outside of the refugee world, and kind of applies it to larger class structures and applies it to vulnerable people of all kinds, and also privileged people of all kinds. It kind of looks at both sides of things. So that's what I've been working on. It's almost finished. And then I am just on my way to join the University of St. Andrews in the permanent faculty there. So I'm about to move to Scotland. Yay, I'll let you know next year what the differences are between American and Scottish asylum. But you know, I do know that the French, that it's really tough in France because of all the anecdotal information that I have heard about similar kind of tactics to catch out people, and also just it's kind of a like Holland, a very closed society in terms of who's accepted and who's, you know, taken into various communities. You know, and of course there's a giant language barrier because French is so very hard to learn. But there's a refugee family who lives nearby us, and you know, I talk to them a lot, and they are also Iranian. It's just an incredible coincidence, actually, that there's these Iranian refugees who live nearby in this tiny village. And I've spent a lot of time talking with them, and they complain about a lot of the small indignities that were very similar to what I experienced in the US. You know, people, for example, thinking they're doing such good, offering work but paying you peanuts, or you know, people you know, asking you, oh, why do you have a nice phone? You know, things like that. I think another thing, I guess, that would go into the medium term bucket of my little framework before would be that, you know, as people settle in, you want to watch out for their dignity, and you want to understand that anything that wouldn't be appealing to you probably won't be appealing to them, you know, and then not to question things like every little joy that they have in their life. Like, just don't be a jerk. The medium term is like, then spend the next 10 or 15 years as they make their home amongst your people, not being a jerk.
It seems so simple, but it's so sad that we have to sort of emphasize these things.
Yes, and people fail
exactly.
People fail all over the world at this, and including all of us. I mean, we've all been awful to someone.
Yeah, thank you. So this next question has to do with solidarity, and in particular, solidarity between different groups of refugees. So this is from Sung. How do you imagine the solidarity between different groups of refugees who shared similarities, but also divergences in their histories of being oppressed? Quite a few naturalized refugees in the US appear to turn against what they call, quote unquote, illegal immigration, while in fact, that was how they got into the US in the first place. So what do you think about this, and what can we do to promote a better sense of solidarity that does not flatten refugees' diverse particularities?
Yeah, well, you know, I think one thing to really realize that one thing you realize when you have, you know, just known all kinds of different humans in your life after you, is that whether they're refugees or whether, you know, they're migrants or from this country or that country or whatever, there are thinking and unthinking people, self-aware and unself-aware people, selfish and unselfish people in every single group, right? So a refugee who wants to roll up the ladder behind them, right, could very well just be a bad human. Like, there are bad humans among every single category. Or they might just be unthinking, or they might just be wanting to safeguard what they have. Maybe they're so traumatized, they just want to wrap a blanket around themselves and their family and push everyone else out, right? There's more or less justifiable reasons for it. But the thing is, it's not really your job to try to make, you know, figure out their psychology of what they want. They may not be the ally that you're seeking, right? I think there's so much existing solidarity between groups of refugees now, people who made it through, who feel like, oh my gosh, I want to help the next group, who see you know, threads of their story and other people's story from all kinds of different places. I know people who have, you know, befriended each other just because of the fact that they're both new to the UK, just with huge cultural barriers between them, language barriers between them. Like, all they share is maybe just a few scars because they've both been tortured, you know, like, and that's such a huge thing to share, but it's also like not cultural connection, and they've completely overcome that, right? I've seen lots of different refugees who go to the same charity, and then they get to know each other based on, say, a sport that they love, or some, you know, some hobby that they love or whatever, and then they become the best of friends. And again, very unlikely places, far flung, with different languages. So, like, you know, human kindness, compassion, and love always overcomes all of that, as long as you do have some of that, and, you know, an openness. And so I think that as far as solidarity goes, it always works better when you go looking, you know, when you go looking for your allies in all kinds of unlikely places, and understand that not everyone you run into will be that person, right? A lot of people will be completely closed off. How do you promote that, you know, solidarity? I think it happens naturally, but you have to open up the various opportunities for meeting people. That's why I love the befriending charities. I'm on the board of one in the UK called Host Nation, and they put people together based on, you know, just proximity, because they know that it's traveling is expensive, and based on age, and also based on hobbies, right? So people can immediately become friends and get drawn into each other's communities and circles, and that one meeting can turn into like a dozen meetings, and then suddenly there's just a lot more points of connection, and many more points of connection means many more opportunities for people to be awesome to each other, as is their nature. You know.
Yeah, definitely. I've been really heartened to see sort of the outpouring of support from Vietnamese refugees, for example, to more recent refugees from Afghanistan, and thinking about these connections. Yeah.
Oh, I love to see that. That's really cool.
So our next question, just to elaborate on your sort of understanding of the gendered aspects of shame. So Elham says, do you find shame mostly among refugee women? And if not, is it different entirely with men? So what are they ashamed of and why? So how is this experience of shame perhaps gendered?
Oh gosh, no, I don't think it's any less in men.
Mhm.
I feel like and I feel like there's a lot of the same kinds of shame. And I think it's very cultural depending on where you come from. But with men, for example, you see a lot of torture survivors who are, just absolutely reeling with shame, about not having withstood a particular torture, about having given up a name, about having gone along with something because they were being tortured, just about their physical weakness, having been at the wrong place at the wrong time. They take on all of the shame on themselves, having not been able to protect their family. Rape victims, whether they're men or women, feel the same crippling shame. Like that shame there is not changed. I think it's just it's silencing on both sides, especially from Middle Eastern countries. They come in, they don't want to confess that, even though it would get them, refuge, it would get them asylum. And then let's see, often both groups, men and women, have shame related to, family, that they feel that they have, abandoned or betrayed, religious things that they feel that they've left behind. There's all kinds of shame just related to, children, fate of children. Women, of course, from the Middle East, of course, there is sometimes a lot of just shame to do with things like, divorce, or, wanting to leave an abusive husband, or wanting to leave a non-abusive husband, just wanting to leave, or things that are very, very gendered and very specific to that culture. But I think for the most part, the biggest sources of shame that I've seen are things that are just like, it's just not their fault, like sexual orientation and identity, gender identity, torture, rape, things that have happened.
This next question is from Sydney, sort of picking up on a conversation that we were having earlier. So do you think that the Geneva Convention's definition of a refugee should be redefined? And if so, how would you improve its current definition, or what other criteria should be included?
I think that, trying to kind of parse out a particular definition for a particular moment in time is always short-sighted, because you just never know what that next horrifying thing is going to be, right? So, I mean, you don't know if it'll be a war, or if it'll be a flood, or if it's going to be a war in gangs, or if it's going to be a revolution, or political, or whatever. I think we should take responsibility for the wounded and the endangered of the world. So I think it should be reduced to basically people in danger, right? And I think that we should then move on to dealing with the question, instead of dealing with the question of, are you in danger for the right reasons? We believe you're going to die, just not for the right reasons. They don't even stop to think, wait a minute, so you're not going to save this person because they're not going to die for the right reasons? Like, let's stop and think about that in terms of what we owe to our fellow man. So instead of parsing out stupid, bureaucratic, legalistic questions, we put the whole thing aside and say, you know what, we owe something to endangered people of the world, right? And then move on to how. Move on to things like resources and education, and making the wait times short, and making neighborhoods welcoming, and making kind of the whole process, I guess, more efficient and less harmful, right? I'm not advocating for like open borders across the world. Wow, I just flicked this. Open borders across the world. I'm advocating for a system that makes sense, and a system that is humanizing, not completely degrading, and a system that doesn't create extra bureaucracy and waste like so much money just in these kind of silly questions, right?
And just the waiting times, right? That we have to go through this like very individualized bureaucratic process.
And people
are waiting for years.
Yeah. Their potential, their fire, their sense of self, their ability to contribute to the world changes after 2 years of idleness and waiting.
Definitely. So this next question is from Brian. So what has been the most enriching part of being an author writing about the refugee identity?
Well, I mean, it's been talking to the people. So I mean, when I first went to that first camp, I read about it in the book. I was so nervous because I wasn't sure, you know, I was asking for the only precious thing these people have left, which is their story. And then, you know, there was this field of ISO boxes in this refugee camp, and I started walking through it, and I had been given a list of which ISO boxes contained Iranian families or Afghan families who would speak my language. And I wasn't even supposed to have this list. I kind of tucked it away. I memorized some numbers, and I would just kind of go past, you know, kind of slowly past their door, trying to decide whether to knock. And I knocked on that first door, and I just kind of, in my accented Farsi, was like, you know, hello, I'm a writer and I used to be an Iranian refugee, and I just wanted to ask if, and they're like, come in, have some tea. And then they wouldn't, like, they made me tea, they wouldn't let me go for like hours. And then by the time, and of course, you know, everyone has phones. So then by the time I left that house, I was kind of like on that ISO box, I was on my way to the next one. The next one, the person sticks their head out the window. It's like, are you the Iranian woman that's walking around? And so then I get taken into the next team. I have to say that it was torture for the bladder, those days. But it was so moving. They were so generous and they were so kind, and they shared so much of themselves with me. And it was a lot of funny moments. Like the whole thing became such a human interaction. I forgot about my book for a long time, and I was just, you know, hearing about their lives, and they were hearing about mine, and we were joking about Iranian things and all of the things that I didn't know because I'd been out for so long, and, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I know we just have a couple minutes left, and we also want to do a quick closeout, but maybe just one question that we can answer quickly, one more. So this question's from Catherine and just picks up on your conversation about truth and facts. So I was wondering if you could speak to your understanding of truth and facts as it applies to deeply personal, familial, and personal narratives. Can you talk about the personal negotiations and perhaps healing necessary in the creation and writing of this work?
Yeah. Do you know, it's funny, I think you have just stumbled on the question I find the most unanswerable and the hardest, because not unanswerable in that I'm not going to answer it. What I mean is, this is a hard one, right? Because everyone thinks that their truth is the absolute truth. And there is the question of point of view. And I have this wonderful book that I like to go back and read over. It's called Writing Life Stories by Bill Rohrbeck. And Bill Rohrbeck, you know, he's a wonderful teacher of writing and memoir. And he talks about all of the things that you can, all of the ways that, you know, you should anchor the story in a point of view, in your own point of view, especially when you're writing memoir. But often that means completely abusing someone else's point of view because people disagree. He shares a story about how, you know, at a family dinner, he started telling the story of how when he was a little kid, in a really very, very cold winter, he licked a telephone pole when he was little, and his tongue froze to the telephone pole, right? And he finished telling the story with all kinds of pizzazz and stuff. And then his sister's like, yeah, I remember that story, except it wasn't you, it was me, right? And then they argue for ages and ages about whose tongue got stuck to the pole. And he asks, like, wow, but this is so visceral. I remember it. I remember the sensation. And she says, well, I remember it. I remember the sensation. And this is what the memory does to, you know, to stories. It alters it. And at the end of the day, all we have is the memory. The experts say that only the first time you remember something, you're actually remembering the event. The very next time you're remembering the memory, right? Okay. So, and our memories lie to us all the time. So at the end of the day, there is no accessing those familial truths. There's no accessing what actually happened. There is just your point of view, and as honest as you can be with yourself. And now there is the question of, are you being honest with yourself? And that is a years-long reflection that takes a lot of work, a lot of self-work. Like, so for example, if you want to write a story that is your particular point of view in a family situation, like, why are you trying to tell that story? You know, are you trying to get at a particular truth? Are you trying to get revenge on someone? Are you trying to, like, cement your point of view? I think all of these things kind of lead us to turn over various kind of, like, I guess, the emotional leftovers of that event or whatever, and help us really assess, like, are we in a position to tell that story? Are we in a position to tell a truth, even if it's only one truth? But I think that's as close as I've gotten, because the thing is that, like, my family gets really mad about my stories, you know, because they're in my point of view. And I have never been able to reconcile, especially with my mother, never been able to reconcile the way I want to tell the stories with the way she wants them told. So that's why I find that one personally hard.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for sharing. So I just want to invite Jennifer to come back on, and Jennifer will do a quick closeout for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dina, for your powerful insights and so much that you've shared with us today. I took down so many notes of gems, like the distinction between a truthful story and an honest listener, the degrading effects of having to perform gratitude as a refugee, the need to rethink, to really rethink displacement and solutions and its solutions to it, as well as its connections to systemic racism. Writing as an act of refusal and a life-affirming practice, but also kind of leading to family conflict. You know, there's so many, and also really concrete ways that we can really act in response to the many things that you've shared. Thank you. Thanks also to Evyn for engaging Dina in such a riveting conversation with all your, you know, really brilliant insights, and also managing all of the questions. The way that you took us through the conversation was really stimulating, and I know added so much. And also to all the attendees, for your terrific questions and participation. I know many of Professor Gandhi's students are in the room, and you know, engaging students as part of this series is really a core to what we want to do as well. So thank you for attending. And you know, this year we're really prioritizing having cross-cutting conversations with writers, with activists, with people on the ground. And so today starts us off on that journey. So please watch out for news about our winter and spring events. We will be advertising them as they are organized. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you guys for having me. It was really great.
Thank you, everyone in the audience. It was so great to have you in our conversation. Lots of thanks in the chat.
Yeah, I can see this is really lovely to see. I love the chat.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to keep it enabled so it doesn't seem like we're talking to a blank screen.
Yes. Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to take off.
Thank you. All right. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.